we won't be able to do him justice in 10 minutes, but
Well, this can be part one.
Tommy was sort of like if you had to pin a label on him, which I don't really like to do. He was like a Teddy Wilson of bebop or something, but he wasn't a bebopper, you know. But he had that same, you know, elegance quality and facility here. We had talked about Jimmy Rolls as an accompanist. Tommy was also a brilliant accompanist, and that's one of the things that perhaps kept him a bit under wraps, because he had this very long association with Ella. And this was, of course, for a musician, not only at that time, but maybe especially at that particular time, but any time, a steady gig like that, and Norman Granz considered that he was very well paid for that, was something that was a very lucky break. On the other hand, it kept him on the wraps in terms of his own, you know, visibility. And that may have had something to do with the fact that he never really became a household name. I mean, among jazz fans, he certainly was, but he never quite achieved the popular success that he really should have. I think Tommy was the, you know, if I were going to pick somebody to be a definition of the word taste, I think Tommy was that. He had perfect taste. Never played a false and meretricious note. Everything was in the service of music. And he had a beautiful touch. He had great time. He had terrific ears. And he was also, as I started to say, was a great accompanist. And not only to singers, but in bands. And that's why he was used so much. For instance, by Blue Note, I mean, he was a very prolific sideman. He's on a lot of famous recordings. And he comes out of Detroit, and I got to interview Tom. I got to know Tom. We had some delightful times together in Denmark on a couple of occasions. One was when I was traveling with a George Wein tour in Europe, and the other was when I was involved in this Jazz Park Prize, and he was one of the recipients of that. So we got to hang out. We probably hung out more in Copenhagen than we did in New York. Tommy was the kind of person who never said a bad thing about anybody. You know. And I think that he came out of that Detroit environment. Was it Baker's Lounge, you know, where everybody played, and he got a chance even when he was quite young, you know, to play with practically everybody, because you had all these visiting stars who came in without their own groups of the house band, and that's where he, you know, worked with people like Elvin and Paul Chambers. He was a perfect rhythm section guy, but it was on his own that you really got to appreciate him. And my friend who recently passed, Kiyoshi Koyama, the Japanese producer and critic and editor, was somebody who really loved Tommy and used him. And I remember was present at one of his relatively rare, I mean, there are a number, and I did notes for a couple at least, of albums of his own, but this one was interesting because it was the first one, it was one of the earliest with digital recording. It was done for a Japanese label, and we were all amazed at the quality of the playback sound. But that was a chance to see Tommy in action, and he was just so easy to work with, untemperamental, and clear about what he wanted, and amicable with his colleagues, and altogether, a sterling example of, what a musician with a big reputation like he had, especially among musicians, but he was very un-star-like in his behavior. He was a sweetheart. He had an interesting marriage, as you may have heard, but his wife was Diana, who had been a would-be singer, and she worked, her professional name was Diana Hunter. You get it? Diana.
Oh, Diana the Huntress, yes.
You have to know about Roman.
Yeah, it took a while. Is she still with us?
We don't know. Both Darrell Sherman and I got to be quite friendly with. Darrell was in on the Danish thing that I talked about earlier, one of them. Darrell became quite friendly with Tommy and used him. She had him on one of her dates, and was very fond of him. And Diana. And Diana was a character. She watched over Tommy like a hawk. I don't mean in terms of his, I'm talking professionally. Everything had to be right. She made sure that he got as much money as she could get out of club owner. She wanted complete silence when he played, and that sometimes got him in trouble with club owners, when she would insist that there be no talking, and sometimes, I remember once where she actually actively got a party ejected out of a club, which meant, in this particular case, that they never hired Tommy again, because they didn't want that, in other words, she overdid it in terms of being protective of him. And that was, that could be problematic. Same thing with photos, don't take photos of which worked well in the Village Vanguard, where Lorraine was notoriously proactive. So anyway, Tommy was such a lovely person, and it came out in his music, he had such perfect taste, and at a time when a lot of piano players in the modern vein were sometimes got too complicated harmonically or rhythmically because they wanted to show how they derived from Charlie Parker or whatever. Tommy clearly did, although he had roots before that, but he never did anything to show off technique that he had plenty of. It was always so musical. So I thought of him as a kind of, I don't like to use the word bebop too much, but if I were to slogan him, I would call him a bebop Teddy Wilson, and his touch was lovely. But he could also adapt to almost any musical circumstance. And when you had to work with him, as I had the opportunity to observe during that Danish incident, because with the Jazz Pro Prize, you got to play a couple of live concerts for a rather large audience, and also make a recording, and also maybe appear on TV or whatever. So it was, it was a nice bit of change. It was very nice, and you got paid also individually for things like recording and so on. But it was, it was quite a bit of work. Now, he was so patient and so, amicable about everything, and it was just a pleasure to watch him interact with people. When he became ill, it was so sad. visited him in the hospital a couple of times, and he, you know, he knew, but he, you know, he dealt with it very, you know, how, you know, as best you can do that. There was no sense of him wanting you to feel bad for him, you know. He'd try to make it as easy as possible. But, well, I went through many things like that. Well, I hope to be able to deal with it when my time comes. But he was one of the, really, I don't like to overuse that word when talking about, you know, talking about a man, but he was a sweet man, Tommy Flanagan was. He was just, there was nothing about him that was off-putting in any way. I never saw him lose his temper. He dealt with things, and you know, that was one of the reasons why he lasted so long with Ella. Ella was, you know, there was nothing bad about Ella, but Ella was hypersensitive. You know, she was very. You think after all the accolades she had and everything, she was still very sensitive to criticism. She was very vulnerable, and he could deal with that. You know, and that's why she didn't want to let him go. You know. And Norman Granz, of course, was. Norman, in my opinion, Norman didn't use Tommy enough. You know, he could have done a lot more with Tommy on his own. But I'm not even sure whether Tommy might not have been with Tommy on the contract to go on. I'll have to ask Mike Cuscona about that. Anyway, Tommy was a great guy to get to know, and I was happy to be able to do much unexpected, you know, many years after his death, to do the notes for this live recording of Tommy and Jackie Byard, which was sort of, I knew both of them well, and it was such an unusual combination of two people who were really each one of them great in his own way and great on the keyboard, but they were so different. But it worked well. Yeah.